My son forced me out and took $3.1 million for her revenge. By midnight, I had the police at my door.
Have you ever been told to leave your own home by the very child you once raised in your arms? The morning it happened, my son stood at the doorway, his eyes cold, his words sharper than the winter air. He said, "It was no longer my place to decide anything here." Then he locked the door behind me. $2.2 million sat in the accounts my husband and I built over a lifetime, and within days they were gone, claimed by the woman who called herself my daughter-in-law. Kindness had turned into a weapon, obedience had become the price of staying under my own roof, and I refused to pay it. That night, with nowhere else to go, I called 911. Subscribe if you know the weight of being treated as a guest in the home you built. I was 72 when they moved in, telling me it would only be for a while. I believed their smiles. I believed we could be a family again. I never thought each step I took in my own hallway would start to feel like trespassing. After the police left that night, I kept thinking back to how it all began. It was not sudden. It was a slow change, the kind you do not notice until you wake up and realize you are living a different life than the one you thought you had. 2 years earlier, my house had been too quiet, the kind of quiet that made the walls seem farther apart. My husband had been gone for almost 8 years, and the creak of the front porch at sunset only reminded me of the space he used to fill. I kept busy with my garden, a weekly book club, and church, but evenings were still the hardest. That was when Caleb called. He said their place needed repairs and that they might need somewhere to stay for a while. Vanessa's voice chimed in the background, warm and polite, thanking me in advance. I remember smiling into the phone, telling them, of course, my door was always open. It felt like an answered prayer. Maybe this was my chance to see my son every day again, to cook meals together, to sit on the porch and watch the sky turn gold over the Texas hills. I pictured laughter at the dinner table, the sound of 2 more coffee cups clinking in the morning. I wanted to believe this would bring us closer. The day they arrived, the air smelled like rain, and the boxes in the back of their truck were stacked high. Caleb carried the heavier ones while Vanessa walked ahead with a vase wrapped in newspaper. She smiled at me as if we were already friends. I took that as a good sign. I had prepared their room upstairs. Fresh sheets, the quilt I had sewn years ago, and a small vase of flowers from the garden. On the dresser, I left a note that simply said, "Welcome home." I wanted them to feel that way. Home. That first week was everything I hoped for. Caleb and I made breakfast together. Vanessa complimented my blueberry muffins, and we even sat on the porch one evening as the cicadas sang in the trees. I told myself this was the start of something better. Looking back, I see how easily I let my guard down. There were moments I could have questioned things, small things, but I pushed them aside. Like the way Vanessa's eyes moved around the room the first time she stepped into the living room. It was not a casual glance. It was as if she was taking inventory. Still, I ignored the feeling. I told myself she was just noticing the decor, maybe looking for inspiration for when their own place was ready. I had no reason to suspect anything. After all, this was family. In those early days, we found a rhythm. Caleb would leave for work in the morning. Vanessa sometimes joined me for coffee before heading out for errands. She asked about my recipes, about the history of the house, even about the land my husband had left me. I enjoyed telling the stories, the way her eyes lingered when I mentioned numbers or property lines barely registered at the time. On Sundays, we all went to church together. Sitting side by side in the pew, I felt a sense of belonging I had missed for years. People from the congregation would smile at us, calling us a beautiful family. I liked hearing that. I think I needed to hear that. One evening, a light rain was falling, and we sat by the window with steaming mugs in hand. Vanessa asked if she could rearrange the porch furniture for better seating when guests came over. I laughed and told her she could do as she pleased. It was such a small thing, and I thought it was sweet that she wanted to be involved. That night, as I closed the curtains in my bedroom, I caught a glimpse of them in the driveway, talking quietly. Caleb had his hands in his pockets. Vanessa's arms were crossed. They both glanced toward the house. I told myself they were just making plans for the weekend. Family life has a way of lulling you into comfort. You see what you want to see. You hear the words that fit the picture you've painted in your head. In my picture, Caleb was still my little boy who needed his mother's cooking, and Vanessa was the daughter-in-law I had always wanted. When I think back on it now, I realize those weeks were not the beginning of togetherness. They were the beginning of something else entirely. But at that moment, I could not see it. All I saw was my son sitting across from me at dinner, his fork tapping against his plate, Vanessa smiling as she poured more sweet tea into my glass. I wanted to hold on to that image. I wanted to believe it was real. So I did. I let the warmth of those first days wrap around me like a blanket. I let myself believe that we were a family again. I did not yet know that blankets can also smother, and that sometimes the quietest moments are the ones hiding the loudest storms. If you have ever clung to the hope that people will change just because you love them, then you know the kind of blindness I am talking about. That blindness kept me smiling through the early weeks, not realizing that the ground beneath me was already shifting. It started with the living room. One afternoon, I came back from the grocery store and found the old floral armchair pushed into the hallway. It was the one my husband and I used to share on quiet evenings, reading or watching the rain through the front window. In its place sat a sleek gray leather sofa, long and low, like something from a showroom. Vanessa stood nearby, smoothing the cushions as if they needed her approval. Caleb came in from the kitchen and said it was time for a change. He told me it would make the space feel more modern. I mentioned that the chair had been with us for decades, that it fit perfectly in that corner. Caleb brushed it off, saying it was just a chair and Vanessa was trying to make the place more comfortable for everyone. His tone was light, but it landed heavier than he knew. The next day, the porcelain tea set from my grandmother was gone from the hutch in the dining room. I found it in a box in the storage closet, the kind of box you close with packing tape. In its place sat a shiny espresso machine with chrome handles and a digital screen. Vanessa explained that it would make mornings easier. She said the tea set was beautiful but not practical. In the kitchen, small shifts kept happening. The pantry shelves were rearranged. Jars I had kept in the same place for years now lined up in perfect rows, labeled in bold black letters. The sugar jar my husband carved from oak was pushed to the back of the top shelf, almost out of reach. It was not just the things they moved. It was the way my voice seemed to count less. One evening over dinner, I mentioned a local festival coming up. Caleb smiled without looking up from his plate and said they already had plans. Vanessa nodded and added that they had been meaning to try a new restaurant in the city. I let the conversation pass, though I felt the space between us widen. The shift in control became clearer when a list appeared on the refrigerator door. It was printed in neat columns, titled Kitchen Rules. It laid out when meals should be cooked, how leftovers were to be stored, and a note at the bottom that dishes should be washed and put away immediately after use. I read it twice, feeling a mix of confusion and disbelief. My own kitchen now had rules I had not written. Soon after, the room I used for reading and keeping family records was cleared of my books and photo albums. In their place were rolled yoga mats, scented candles, and a speaker on the floor. Vanessa called it her wellness space. She told me I could still use it, but only when she was not in the middle of her sessions. One night, as I passed the hallway on my way to bed, I caught the sound of their voices behind the closed door of their room. Vanessa's was low but sharp, telling Caleb that as long as I thought I was in charge, nothing in the house would feel settled. She said he needed to prove he could make decisions without asking me first. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the railing, listening to the silence that followed. I went to bed without a word, staring at the ceiling until morning. These changes were small on their own, easy to dismiss if I wanted to keep the peace. But together, they were shaping the house into something unrecognizable. And though I still moved through each room as if it were mine, I could feel the ground shifting under my feet. I told myself it was only temporary. I told myself family could adapt to each other. But deep down, I knew the way things had started to turn would not simply turn back. It did not take long for the changes to move past furniture and decor. Soon, it was the way the entire house operated. One Saturday morning, I came into the kitchen to make breakfast and found Vanessa already there, moving quickly between the stove and the counter. She had a clipboard propped up beside her, jotting down items from the pantry. Without looking at me, she mentioned that she was organizing the grocery list for the week and that it would be easier if I let her handle the shopping from now on. She said it would cut down on waste and keep things consistent. When I reached for the coffee mugs, I noticed a laminated schedule pinned above the counter. It listed cooking times, cleanup duties, and even quiet hours for the evenings. At the bottom, in neat print, it said, "All household members are expected to follow these guidelines." It was not just the kitchen. The hallway closet where I kept my winter coats now held neatly stacked bins labeled with Caleb and Vanessa's names. My coats were moved to the basement, hung on a rack near the water heater. The small office that had once been my retreat for reading and sorting papers had been fully converted into Vanessa's yoga studio. When I asked if I could bring back a small desk for my personal use, she smiled and said the space needed to stay open for her classes, and it would be better for me to keep my paperwork in my bedroom. The changes extended to the living room as well. My sewing basket, usually kept near the window seat, was tucked away in the hall closet. Vanessa replaced the bookshelf's top row of family photos with abstract art prints she had ordered online. Caleb seemed fine with it all, often telling me to let her make the place feel like home. One evening, we were sitting down to dinner. I mentioned a nearby farmer's market that had just opened for the season and suggested we go together. Vanessa put down her fork and thanked me for the idea, but explained they already had reservations at a restaurant in the city. Caleb nodded in agreement before I could respond. After that, I started to notice how often my suggestions were politely brushed aside. Weekend plans were set without asking me. The television was tuned to shows I had never watched. Music played in the evenings that made it hard to read in the living room, though no one seemed to notice if I left early for bed. The shift was not loud or sudden. It was quiet and steady, like water wearing down stone. I still had a room upstairs, my name still on the mailbox, but the center of the house no longer belonged to me. One night, while heading upstairs, I heard voices from the kitchen. Vanessa was speaking in a low, measured tone. She told Caleb that as long as I still acted like the house was mine, nothing would feel settled for them. She said he needed to make it clear where I stood in this arrangement. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the hum of the refrigerator between her words. Caleb did not argue. I went to my room without making a sound. From then on, I moved more carefully through the house. I tried not to take up space in the common areas for too long. Meals became quieter. I found myself timing when to make tea so as not to be in the kitchen at the same time as Vanessa. The walls of the house had not moved, but the space I was allowed to occupy had grown smaller. It was still my address, but it was no longer my home. The days settled into a quiet routine. I began waking earlier than usual, slipping into the kitchen while the house was still dark. The new coffee machine hummed and clicked in a way that never felt as warm as the old kettle, but I learned its buttons and kept the mugs lined up the way Vanessa preferred. I still baked small batches of muffins on weekends, leaving them on the counter for Caleb, though I noticed he often left the house without taking one. The tea set from my grandmother remained packed away in the storage closet, and I no longer reached for it. I told myself it was easier this way. A new decoration appeared above the coffee station one morning. It was a small wooden sign, the kind you might find in a gift shop, painted in cheerful script. Less drama, more peace. I stood there for a long moment, reading the words. I could not decide if it was meant for me. I chose not to ask. The house felt quieter even when all three of us were home. Vanessa moved through the rooms with a kind of practiced efficiency. Caleb seemed busier, spending more time in the den or on his phone. Meals were shorter, conversations lighter. I learned to let my thoughts stay in my head. One afternoon, I returned from the market with a bag of fresh peaches. I set them on the counter and went to wash my hands. When I came back, the peaches were gone from the counter. Vanessa had sliced them into a glass dish, sprinkled them with sugar, and placed them in the refrigerator. She said it would keep them fresh longer. I nodded and thanked her, though I had planned to eat one right away. The small adjustments kept stacking up. I began keeping my personal items in my room instead of the shared spaces. My knitting basket sat in the corner near the window upstairs. The photo album stayed closed in a drawer. Even my favorite cardigan hung on the back of my bedroom chair rather than in the hall closet. I tried to focus on the positives. The yard was well kept. The house stayed tidy, and there was always food in the pantry. I told myself that peace was worth a little compromise. That was the phrase I repeated in my mind whenever I felt out of place. One evening, Caleb came into the kitchen as I was making tea. He mentioned that Vanessa had a stressful week and asked if I could be patient with her. I said I understood. He smiled faintly and walked away, leaving his cup on the counter for me to wash. I noticed I had started moving more quietly around the house, closing doors softly, keeping my footsteps light, pausing in the hallway if I heard voices. It was not fear exactly. It was more like avoiding the risk of disturbing the balance that had settled over us. The sign above the coffee machine caught my eye again the next morning. Less drama, more peace. I poured the coffee into 2 mugs, set them on the counter, and stepped back. The smell filled the room, but the warmth I used to feel was no longer there. Peace had become something I maintained with silence. And silence, I was starting to realize, could make a person disappear long before they were gone. It was late in the evening when I left my room to get a glass of water. The hallway was dim, and the rest of the house was quiet. As I passed the door to what used to be my small office, I heard Vanessa's voice. She was on the phone, her tone sharper than I had ever heard it in public. She was giving instructions. Move everything into the Whitford Holdings 2 Trust before she changes her mind. This is the only way to make her feel what loss really is. Her voice dropped even lower, but I caught the rest. She said it was payback for something I had said at their wedding years ago. She had not forgotten the moment I suggested she take a class to improve her pronunciation so she would feel more confident in front of Caleb's business colleagues. I stood frozen just outside the doorway, my hand tightening around the edge of the wall. The realization settled heavy in my chest. This was not just about redecorating or setting house rules. This was deliberate. This was planned. Her laugh came next, short and without warmth. She told the person on the other end to hurry because once the paperwork was filed, there would be nothing I could do. I felt the air leave my lungs. I moved away quietly, my bare feet barely making a sound against the floor. In the kitchen, I stood at the sink, staring out the window at the dark yard. The porch light was on, casting a pale circle over the steps, but the rest of the yard was swallowed in shadow. I thought about all the changes in the past months: the furniture, the rules, the quiet exclusion from decisions. I thought about the way Caleb had begun speaking to me, gentle but distant, as if his mind was already made up before I even opened my mouth. It was all leading here. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. It was not anger that came first. It was a deep, sinking disappointment. I had opened my home with the hope of bringing us closer, and now it was being used to push me out. When I finally went back upstairs, I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the hum of the house. The walls felt closer than before. I reached for the small wooden box on my nightstand and opened it. Inside were my marriage certificate, a few old letters from my husband, and the key to the lockbox at the bank. I lay awake long after the rest of the house had gone silent. The words I had overheard kept replaying. This is the only way to make her feel what loss really is. By morning, I knew something had shifted in me. The coffee was still made, the kitchen still tidy, but the way I moved through the house was different. I had stopped trying to fit into the space they allowed me. I began noticing things I had ignored before. Envelopes addressed to financial institutions on the entryway table. Caleb leaving the room when certain calls came in. Vanessa closing her laptop quickly when I walked past. The picture I had held in my mind of us as a family was fading. In its place was the truth. I was not part of their plan. I was the obstacle in it. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. I did not yet know exactly what I would do, but I understood that silence would no longer protect me. Whatever came next would not be about keeping the peace. It would be about keeping myself. The morning after I overheard Vanessa, I drove to the bank with a knot in my stomach. I wanted to check the lockbox to see if the documents inside were still safe. The teller recognized me, but her smile was hesitant. She returned with the manager, who explained that several accounts tied to my name had recent withdrawals. The amounts were not small. I signed the forms with a shaking hand and asked to see the transaction records. The dates lined up with the days Caleb had been gone longer than usual. The withdrawals had been made in person, but the signatures were not mine. I left the bank with copies of the statements in my purse and a heavy, growing certainty that I was running out of time. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as always. The porch chairs sat where they had been the night before. The blinds were half drawn in the living room. I walked to the door and put my key in the lock. It stopped halfway. I tried again, slower, but it would not turn. I knocked once. Then Caleb opened the door. He stepped aside, avoiding my eyes. He said the old lock had been sticking and he replaced it for safety. The words were casual, but I heard the edge under them. I went inside and headed to the mailbox in the hallway. Among the circulars and envelopes was a thick, official letter addressed to me. It was from the insurance company that had handled my husband's life policy. I opened it at the kitchen counter. My name had been removed as the primary beneficiary. The new name was Vanessa Miles. I stood there for a long time, the paper flat under my hands. The sound of the refrigerator filled the room. Caleb walked past, glancing at the page but saying nothing. In the afternoon, I carried a small suitcase upstairs and began to pack. I moved slowly, folding only what I needed. A few changes of clothes, my address book, the wooden box from my nightstand. I left the rest in place. The sun was setting when I brought the suitcase down. Vanessa was in the living room, her feet tucked under her, scrolling on her phone. She did not look up. Caleb came in through the back door as I stepped onto the porch. He asked where I was going. I told him I needed some time away. He nodded, as if he had been expecting it. I walked to the car without turning back. As I started the engine, I could see the house in the rearview mirror. The windows reflected the last light of the day, and for the first time since I had opened that door to them, I felt the distance between us become real. The lock might have changed, but the truth was, I had been shut out long before the key stopped fitting. The highway stretched ahead in a straight line, the sky above it turning the pale color that comes before night. I drove without music, the sound of the tires on the asphalt the only rhythm. My suitcase sat in the back seat, leaning to one side with each curve in the road. I pulled into a small roadside motel just outside of town. The neon sign flickered, casting a weak blue light across the gravel lot. Inside, the air smelled faintly of detergent and stale coffee. The clerk slid a key across the counter without asking many questions. The room was small, with thin curtains that swayed each time the wind slipped through the gaps in the window frame. I set the suitcase on the bed and unzipped it, laying out the papers I had brought from the bank and the insurance letter. One by one, I added other documents from my bag: account statements, property records, letters with my name on them that had been forwarded from the house. Under the harsh light of the bedside lamp, the pattern began to form. Transfers from accounts I had managed for decades, changes in ownership on assets that should have been untouchable, the same looping signature where mine should have been, repeated over and over, each one a little less convincing than the last. I realized how many of these papers I had signed in the past without looking closely. Years ago, when my husband was ill, I had given him power of attorney so he could handle certain matters. That document had expired the moment he passed. Somehow, they had found it and used it again. I sat back against the headboard, my hand still holding the paper. The weight of the realization was heavier than I expected. This was not just carelessness or misunderstanding. It was deliberate, and it had been in motion for longer than I wanted to admit. As the wind rattled the window, a name came to mind: Rachel Porter. We had met in high school, kept in touch through the years, and she had become a respected attorney. I remembered her telling me once about her work protecting older clients from financial exploitation. I picked up my phone and scrolled to her number. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. Then I pressed it. When she answered, her voice was steady and certain, as if she had been expecting this kind of call. She told me to keep everything exactly as it was, not to throw away a single envelope or receipt, and to meet her at her office in the morning. After we hung up, I gathered the papers back into neat stacks. The lamp cast sharp shadows across the bedspread. Outside, the wind kept moving through the trees, and I lay down without undressing. Sleep came slowly, broken by the sound of passing trucks on the highway. But underneath the fatigue, there was a current of something I had not felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, something quieter, a readiness to see things clearly, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, the air was crisp and clear as I walked into Rachel's office. It was a converted brick building on the edge of downtown, the kind of place that still smelled faintly of paper and ink. Rachel was already standing when I entered, her dark hair pulled back, glasses perched low on her nose. She waved me in without wasting time. I placed the stack of documents on her desk. She began sorting through them quickly, her eyes moving faster than her hands. Each time she spotted something important, she set it aside in a separate pile. The first thing she confirmed was the forged signatures. She held two papers side by side, one with my real signature from years ago, another from a recent transaction. Even to me, the difference was clear. She said these were more than sloppy imitations. They were deliberate fraud. Then she pointed to a thick, yellowed form in the stack. It was the old power of attorney I had signed for my husband when he was ill. She explained that it had expired the moment he passed, and using it again was a violation of state law. Whoever had submitted it had committed a serious offense. Rachel's voice stayed calm, but her instructions came in a steady rhythm. I was not to contact Caleb or Vanessa. I was to keep every piece of mail, every bank notice, every scrap of paper with my name on it. She told me she would request a temporary restraining order on any further account activity and file an emergency motion to halt changes to property titles. While she spoke, her assistant entered with a laptop and began pulling up court records. Rachel tapped the screen, showing me a pending refinance application for my house. It had been filed online at 12:47 in the morning under Vanessa's name. The lender had already scheduled an appraisal. That was when Rachel leaned back and said this was not just about reclaiming what was mine. It was about stopping them before they locked everything into their control. She said timing would be critical. We spent the next 2 hours compiling a full timeline. Dates of withdrawals, times when Caleb and Vanessa were in control of the house, copies of correspondence from banks and insurance companies. By the time we were done, the piles of paper had been transformed into a coherent story of theft and manipulation. Before I left, Rachel handed me a manila folder. Inside were copies of the initial filings and a checklist of what to watch for in the coming days. She reminded me to stay somewhere safe, to avoid any direct confrontation until the court had issued its orders. Walking out of her office, I felt the weight of the folder in my hands. It was not just paper. It was the beginning of a plan, one built on facts they could not twist. I drove back toward the motel, the late morning sun glinting off the windshield. The road ahead felt different now. It was no longer just a way out. It was a way forward. 2 days after leaving Rachel's office, I was sitting at the small table in the motel room, reviewing the checklist she had given me. My phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. The message was short. He said we should talk, that Vanessa had been under stress and things had gone too far. He wrote that they could return part of the money if I came back and we worked it out privately. The phrase "part of the money" stayed in my mind. It was not an apology. It was an admission. Not long after, Rachel called. Her voice was sharper than usual. She had just received an anonymous email with only one sentence. Check sub-account A713. Scheduled withdrawals. Next in 72 hours. She believed it was a hidden account connected to one of the trusts Vanessa had set up. If the withdrawal went through, the money would likely disappear for good. We had less than 3 days to get a court order to freeze it. Rachel said she could file, but the bank would move faster if we had proof that the account activity was ongoing. That meant we needed to monitor it closely until the motion was in place. The rest of that day, I stayed in the room, my phone within reach, waiting for updates. Rachel's assistant called twice to confirm the bank had been contacted. Every hour felt longer than the last. That night, the wind outside rattled the motel's thin windows. I found myself thinking about Caleb's message again. There was a time when I would have taken any offer just to keep the peace. Now, I saw it for what it was, a way to close the door before the truth reached daylight. The following afternoon, Rachel called again. The withdrawal had been scheduled for the early hours of the third day. She told me to be ready, because if the court order was signed in time, law enforcement might need me to confirm certain documents in person. I hung up and sat back in the chair. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty, the late sun casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I thought about the house, the rooms that had once felt like mine, and how far I had been pushed from them. The deadline pressed closer. The account had to be frozen before the money moved. Every hour mattered. I folded the papers in front of me and placed them back in the folder. The edges aligned perfectly. For the first time in weeks, the fear I had been carrying felt sharper, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a signal to stay steady until the last piece fell into place. The clock was running, and I intended to be there when it stopped. The night of the deadline, I could not sleep. The motel room felt smaller than usual, the shadows in the corners sharper. I had the folder on the table beside me, the papers stacked in the order Rachel had arranged them. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. At 12:30, a heavy knock echoed through the room. It was not frantic, but firm, each strike spaced evenly. I pulled on my sweater and went to the door. A uniformed officer stood there, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. Another officer waited near the railing. He introduced himself and said they were there under instruction from my attorney. The court had granted an emergency order to secure the original documents as official evidence. I stepped aside and let them in. The taller of the two set a small evidence box on the bed while I brought over the folder. They worked methodically, checking each page against a list. The air was quiet except for the soft shuffle of paper. One officer asked me to initial a form verifying that the documents were in my possession before they arrived. I signed and handed it back. When they were finished, the box was sealed with a strip of tamper-proof tape. The taller officer lifted it under one arm and told me it would go directly to the court clerk in the morning. He left me a receipt with the case number written neatly at the top. As they stepped outside, I noticed a plain envelope lying on the floor just beyond the doorframe. It had no return address. Inside was a single printed image. The grainy black and white still showed a man at an ATM, his shoulders hunched, a baseball cap pulled low. Even through the poor quality, I knew it was Caleb. The timestamp in the corner matched one of the withdrawals Rachel had flagged. I slid the photo back into the envelope and locked the door. The room was quiet again, but it no longer felt the same. The papers were gone, yet the proof had only grown stronger. Somewhere across town, Rachel would be preparing for the hearing, building the argument piece by piece. I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting in my lap. The knock had broken the stillness of the night, but it had also set something else in motion. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence before stepping into the light. The morning of the hearing, the sky was pale and cold. I arrived early, following Rachel through the courthouse doors. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. We passed other attorneys speaking in low voices, each carrying their own stacks of files. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy. Caleb and Vanessa sat at the table to the left, both dressed neatly. Vanessa kept her eyes forward, her hands clasped on the table. Caleb glanced at me once, then looked away. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Rachel rose, introducing herself and stating that she represented me in a matter of urgent financial exploitation. She began laying out the timeline. First, the forged signatures, comparing my authentic signature with the crude copies from the recent transactions. She presented the expired power of attorney, pointing out that it had been used illegally years after it ceased to have effect. Next came the property documents, showing the attempted refinance of my house in Vanessa's name. Rachel spoke evenly, but each point was supported by a document, a date, and a chain of custody. When she reached the financial withdrawals, she submitted the photograph from the ATM. The image of Caleb, timestamped to match one of the flagged transactions, was projected on the screen. Rachel explained that these withdrawals came from an account held under a trust Vanessa claimed to control alone. The judge turned to Vanessa and asked for her explanation. She hesitated, then said the transactions were authorized. Rachel leaned forward, asking for the signed authorizations. Vanessa looked toward Caleb. Caleb's voice was low when he spoke, saying that he had handled some of the transactions himself, but only for convenience. The judge's expression did not change. Rachel pointed out that the pattern of withdrawals and document changes showed clear intent to strip me of control over my assets. For more than an hour, the courtroom moved between exhibits and statements. The evidence formed a complete picture, each piece fitting into the next. When Rachel concluded, she asked the court to issue a temporary order freezing all related accounts and restoring full ownership of the properties and policies to me. She also requested a permanent no-contact order against Caleb and Vanessa. The judge sat in silence for a moment, reviewing the notes. Then she announced her decision. The emergency order would stand. All property titles and accounts would be returned to my control. The trust accounts would be audited, and Caleb and Vanessa were prohibited from contacting me directly or indirectly. The sound of the gavel striking the bench was sharp and final. Caleb kept his eyes on the table. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened, but she said nothing. Rachel gathered the documents and handed me the official copy of the order. It was a plain piece of paper, but it felt heavier than anything I had carried in months. As we left the courtroom, the weight I had been holding in my chest began to ease, replaced by something steadier. It was not joy exactly. It was the certainty that what had been taken from me was now back in my hands, and that this time, I would decide what to do with it. The order from the court was still fresh in my hands when I decided I would not go back to the old house. Winning it back was one thing. Living there again was another. The walls held too many shadows, and I had no wish to keep walking through them. I sold the property within a month. The furniture, the fixtures, the rooms where my voice had been ignored all went with it. The proceeds, along with the restored accounts, gave me a freedom I had not felt in years. I bought a bright apartment overlooking the Colorado River. Morning light spilled through the wide windows, touching every corner. There was space for a small desk, a comfortable chair, and shelves for my books. On my first morning there, I brewed coffee in a simple pot I had chosen myself. The steam rose into the quiet room, and I sat at the table without feeling like I was in anyone's way. Outside, the water caught the sunlight, and for a moment, I just watched it move. The decision about what to do next came naturally. I met with Rachel and a few trusted friends to set up the Miles Foundation for Senior Independence. It would fund legal aid and housing support for older women who had been pushed out of their homes through deceit or coercion. The paperwork was signed within weeks. Life moved in a different rhythm. My days were my own, filled with small tasks that mattered only to me. I walked along the river, visited the library, and took calls from women who needed someone to listen. Each time I heard their stories, I felt the same resolve that had carried me through my own fight. I kept one photograph from the old house. It was taken years ago, my husband and I standing on the porch with the hills behind us. It reminded me of a time when home had meant safety. That meaning had changed, but I had found a way to build it again, on my own terms. Peace was no longer something I kept by staying silent. It was something I had claimed, and I knew I would protect it. If you have ever rebuilt your life after being pushed aside, you know that peace feels different when you have earned it. Stories like mine are not rare, and there are many who still need a voice to stand with them. Share this story so others can see that it is never too late to take back what is yours. And if you believe that every person deserves the right to live on their own terms, subscribe and stay with me for more.